It's a real delight to be giving this lecture this morning. Harold Rosen, this lecture is in honour of a series of lectures that run every year at NATE and UKLA, organised by people at the BFI and DARE, which is the Digital Research organisation. Harold Rosen, great hero of mine. I only met him once. Alison talked last night at dinner about meeting your heroes. He didn't even notice me. This was 20 years ago. But his work, and part of what I do in my research is look at Harold Rosen's work, is absolutely critical into what I'm going to say about why remembering the history of the teaching of English is so important. A lot of people know Harold for his work on working class language, but actually the work he did very early in the 1950s down in Woolworth in South London, where he took over an experimental comprehensive English department, is absolutely critical in developing the kind of English which many people here will think is a good model of English, and which I suppose what I'll say in the course of the next 35 minutes or so has been under assault, if you like, over the course of the recent past. So I'm going to draw, yes, on my book. It's up there. I may mention it occasionally in this extended sales pitch. I don't care if you buy it or not, I really don't. I will draw on that book. It's titled English and its Teachers, A History of Policy, Pedagogy and Practice. Now, I was really interested last night, if you were here, Jeff Barton talked about Margaret Matheson's book, which is called The Preachers of Culture. And I'm not comparing my book to hers at all. I do mention it. And I wanted a really snappy title as well for my book. I wanted to call it The Best and Worst of Times, by drawing on Dickens and making an allusion, etc. And of course, this day and age, you've got to have something that's Google friendly. So it has to have English in the title, it's got to have teachers, and that's all you can have. So, Margaret Matheson, if she were here today, she would not have written The Preachers of Culture. She'd have written something much less flowery than that. But anyway, this is a history, okay? And I want to make that point very, very clear from the beginning. It's a history, it's my take on the last 50 years in English teaching. Other people would write a different history. Michael Gove, for example, would write a different history of English teaching, if indeed he can write. This is being filmed, but it's a history, okay? Now, and I'm saying that because actually I like the fact it's my take, it's what I've gleaned from talking to people, it's based on interviews and on document archive material, and it's what I'm saying for me are the key moments in the last 50 years and why we need to remember them. But other people will have different versions, other people will take issue with what I've singled out, and that's great, because what I would like the book to do, if nothing else, is make people argue and debate about English teaching, because one of my great fears, I suppose, is that argument, that debate about what we do, which is part of the rich history of English teaching, is being stifled in many places. Not here, okay? You are the good people. You come and you argue and you debate about English teaching and you're forever pushing the boundaries and taking your practice forward. But I suppose what I'm going to say partly is that you are the minority in many cases, and I suspect you know that already, but I'm here to tell you, you are the special people. Okay, so what am I going to do? Well, the title of this is Past, Present and Post-Truth. Now, I'm going to deal with that chronology slightly differently. I'm going to talk essentially first about the recent past and how we've got to where we are. The reason I'm doing that first is because that's the most miserable bit, and I'll get that out of the way, and then I will be much more brighter and optimistic towards the end of this session. But also because obviously it's where we are now, which is the reason the history is so important. It's why we need to remember where we've come from because of where we are now, where we've got to. What is the present state of English teaching? And I think when we look at it, and I think when we're honest about it, and I think there are some hard truths that we ought to be honest about, what's happening in many, many English classrooms, I think when we are honest about it, we need to remember that past and where we've come from. So I will go on to talk about the more distant past, and people talk about the past as a foreign country. Well, maybe it is. Maybe people do things differently there. But, comparative studies were encouragingly increased to look at other jurisdictions for lessons about how we improve education in this country. So I would argue that even if the past is a foreign country, there is much to learn from it. And I will go on to finish by saying something about why I think, and I won't need to convince you of this, I'm sure, English is desperately, desperately important, more important now than ever in children's education. I'm absolutely convinced of the fact that it is English which is the subject that has the power to change the future, but only if it's done in what I would class and what I would say is, let's say, the right way, for a shorthand way of doing it. So I'm going to go kind of recent past, back, and then look forward to the future. That's the way I'm going to try and deal with the next 30 minutes. So In my book, it's a kind of conceit. It's structured into two halves. It's got the first half is called The Age of Invention, which covers everything from about 1965 up to 88, and then the second half is called The Age of Intervention. Now, that's a structural device. History is not that well organised, as you know. History is messy. But anyway, for the sake of argument, the second half of my book takes this period from 88, which you'll know was the introduction of the first national curriculum, as the starting point of what we've had for 30 years, which is a kind of massive central intervention into English teaching, into education more generally, of course, under this kind of standard-based reform agenda, which is not unique to England. It covers certainly the States, certainly Australia to a certain extent. Different places have got it at different times, but over the course of the last 30 years, this whole kind of standards-driven agenda, a kind of neoliberal agenda, you might call it, introduction of a kind of quasi-market into education, that's been dominant. And English has been absolutely at the centre of the reforms, always. Now, you may have lived through some of these, all of these, you may be new into the profession. Either way, it's undeniable that English has been at the absolute centre of what government has tried to do to change the way that education works in this country. So in England, you may or may not know, I'm sure you do, we've had 5 or 6 national curriculums in that time. It depends which ones you count. Some of you may remember Pascal's curriculum, which came out in '92, I think, which never saw the light of day because it was so reactionary that even the government of the time realised that it would have just been burnt and thrown out of windows. Pascal, the man, of course, who famously wanted us to correct kids' grammar in the playground when they were fighting. It's okay for them to fight as long as they do it in standard English, he would say. Yeah, I mean, he was as crazy as that. And that curriculum was written, but never got beyond being sent out as a consultation document. So 5 or 6 national curriculums. Now, I would argue that progressively over that time, those curriculums have got more impoverished, narrower. You might take the 4Cs curriculum that came out in 2007 as a slight anomaly, but that didn't really have much of a shelf life, as you know, and that's gone. And what we're left with now is a very narrow curriculum. Now, there are reasons for that. There might be benefits to that. But what it certainly isn't is a curriculum that gives you any sense of a debate about English, an intellectual position about what English is or isn't, anything that reflects the kind of things that were in the original national curriculum in '88 from Cox, that really discussed the different positions English teachers took, the different ideas people had about the subject, the different philosophies. The word philosophy does not appear in the new curriculum, nor does the word creativity, of course. We had the national strategies. Now, the national strategies are interesting as to what effect they had. So they lasted for about 8 or 9 years in secondary, from 2001 onwards. I spoke to Sue Hackman, the architect of the national strategies, who ran it as part of the research for the book. And she's very interesting when she talks about what she feels is the legacy of the national strategy. She's very passionate about what she felt was achieved. She's also very honest about what she thinks the limits of what were achieved were. She's particularly interested about what she feels the strategy did in terms of transforming, which was always the word the strategy used, writing pedagogy in this country. I'm not so sure that is the legacy. I think there has been a big legacy from the strategy. I think it's more around structural things, about lesson structures, about the way lessons are talked about and framed and plenaries and all that sort of stuff. But I think there is a legacy from the strategy which has had and is still having an impact on English teaching today. And all of that has happened, of course, as you know, in this kind of atmosphere of accountability and high-stakes assessment. And that has got increasingly ratcheted up over the course of the last 30 years, I would argue. That sense that everything you do is measured and monitored, that is getting worse, in my view, with Progress 8 and the kind of measures that are being put in, the new grading system. Now, I can't hear anybody screaming out, but of course the rhetoric at the moment is all about, well, you've got freedom, you've got a limited national curriculum, you've had SATs removed, you've had levels removed, so you in fact have freedom now like you've never had it before. Well, you may have a view on that, and there will be some people who are using that freedom creatively. But the majority of lessons I see and what I hear and what I look at, and when I was researching for the book, is not that. It's that this freedom, okay, it may be there in the government speak, but actually it's not there on the ground. That's not what is happening. English teaching is becoming increasingly still narrowed and shoehorned to meet certain objectives. So you have, and I love this quote, I finally found it, I've been using this for years without actually attributing it. This is a quote from a literary critic from the 60s who was writing about Beckett and characters in Beckett's plays and about the freedom that they have. And he said that they have the freedom of the slave to crawl east along the deck of a boat travelling west, which I think is a quote for me that frames what is being sold now as freedom. Because actually the juggernaut or the tanker or whatever is moving in one direction. The standards-based reform is still ongoing. And you may have that freedom, but if you're trying to exploit it, you've got that sense that you cannot resist the direction of travel. So I think English teaching now is in a state where it's suffered these 30 years and it's come to a particular place. Now, if you look at Ofsted, for example, many of you will have read the 2012 Ofsted Triennial Report, which I reference obviously in the book, where they talk about English teaching they've seen. And here are a couple of quotes from that, which you'll no doubt know, which Ofsted, and this is written by Phil Jarrett, who was the Ofsted in HMI at the time, the head of the English Inspectorate team, who's a very sound person, I would say, a very sensible person, and his views on English teaching are very sensible, I would say. And he was increasingly frustrated, and anyone who heard him speak will know, about the way in which English teaching was moving, particularly the way in which English teachers felt under pressure from senior leaders in their school to drive certain agendas through because they were being told this is what Ofsted wants. And Phil Jarrett was very much trying to say, well, this is not what Ofsted wants. So in moving English forward, he made very clear things about English teaching that he was seeing that he was dissatisfied with. And you can see them here. Inappropriate attention at too early a stage to skills needed for external tests and examinations, particularly at Key Stage 3. There's the example, of course, of this freedom, Key Stage 3, no SATs, but actually what happens, as you know, in most cases, GCSE just gets pushed down. And Phil Jarrett was very clear that you see kids, and that second quote references it, kids practicing PEE on their first lesson of English in Year 7. He would look at exercise books, and the first thing kids did was PEE. Now, I'm not going to say PE is bad. Well, I'm going to say PE is bad. There you go. PE is bad. But that kind of notion of structuring response to text from such an early age in a way that's seen to be what examiners ultimately want after 5 years is done far too early, according to Ofsted or this report. You can see the second one there. Inspectors believe that teachers often try to teach the skills before students have the opportunity to become confident, independent, mature readers. This leads to learning that's heavily reliant on the authoritative teacher view. Again, very clearly, and this reflects very much what I see in the dozens and dozens of lessons I go to see every year, is that teacher-led work is predominant. Now, you know, I'm going to say this, and I'll say it again in a minute, I'm not blaming teachers for this, and nor does Ofsted, quite frankly, but it's a reality. And I think probably at some point we have to ask some difficult questions about to what extent we are, as a profession, colluding in what's happened to us and our subject, and to what extent we have resisted, and to what extent we have been allowed to resist or actually taken the opportunity to resist. And you can see again there that the comment about the GCSE lessons and that happening in Year 7, and that kids aren't motivated by this notion of I've got an exam in 5 years' time. You know, it's obvious, isn't it? It makes perfect sense when you see it, and yet I see lesson after lesson where kids are being ostensibly motivated by what are the perceived demands of an exam they will or won't take in 4 or 5 years. Well, you know, John Wilkes, who people may know, who was chair of LATE, he was a very influential figure in that SATs boycott in '93 that Betham mentioned. He's very interesting, and I interviewed him for the book, and he talks about the fact that he worked predominantly in East London his entire career with working class kids, and his view, and you may take issue with this, was that those sorts of kids, particularly those sorts of kids, working class kids, perhaps whose families and their parents who are maybe in jobs that are only on kind of weekly or monthly contracts, who get paid cash in hand perhaps, these sorts of children, you know, they don't understand delayed gratification at the best of times. You know, they don't understand anything that's kind of beyond the immediate, and it's not their fault, it's part of the culture. I'm not sure I agree with him, but it kind of ties into that notion that, you know, you're just not going to convince kids of that nature that in 5 years' time what they're doing is going to be important. So in the book, I mean, and as I say, this is Ofsted. This is 5 years ago. I would say it's worse. I see lots and lots of lessons, very good English teachers, new entrants to the profession, people who've been around a long time, all of whom are doing stuff that they kind of know isn't what they want to be doing, but they feel pressured to do it, that they feel it's what they have to be doing, and ultimately this notion comes across. And in the book I write a kind of description of what I would say is an archetypal English lesson that I see today. And it's quite a depressing description, I have to say. I won't read it to you now, we're all depressed enough already. But it is a picture of English, which is something that, you know, I recognise frequently in my day job working with new entrants to the profession and doing research that I do with colleagues. And I would say, well, where are we now? Well, we do have a narrow curriculum. As I say, you know, you might say that gives you freedom. Well, great if you're using it, but actually it's an impoverished curriculum. There's nothing in there about what English is. There's nothing in there you know about creativity, about other cultures. There's nothing in there really about speaking and listening as a pedagogical practice. It's only about speech. So it's narrow. You have that speaking and listening right out at the margins if it exists at all. You've got a very, very limited range of reading. It's all been said before. It's the dead white men. It's the canon that's there now. Now, you know, again, if the freedom's being exploited, that's great. But if what's happening is that those, you know, all that's happening is, you know, previously GCSE texts like Of Mice and Men now get done in year 9 or year 8, and actually then all you've got is a kind of GCSE curriculum going on for 4 or 5 years, that limited range of reading is dangerous, I think. It's dangerous for kids. You have this highly prescribed response to text. I see it time and time again, PEE or PETAL, or there's other ones around. SPEED was the last one I came across, which is statement, point, evidence, explanation, development. And all the kids in the class were going to be speeding by the end of the lesson. And they weren't, of course. But that kind of way of prescribing a response to text and the kind of lip service that gets paid to, well, kids can say anything they like as long as you can justify it. That's not what kids believe. Kids believe there's a right answer and the way in which they're encouraged to structure it. And even in some of the best lessons I've seen, I saw a brilliant lesson on Richard III, where kids did a load of drama stuff, did directions and put post-it notes on how each kid should be directing different bits of the scene. At the end of it, with 15 minutes left, the plenary was, now we're going to write a PE paragraph on what we've learnt about Richard III's character or whatever. And there was, I swear to God, there was an audible groan from the kids. Literally, I'm not saying that for effect, there was. Because that was what happened at the end of every English lesson for them. They had to write a PE paragraph. They had to have something in their book written to show to the senior leaders, to whoever, that work had been done. The English teacher himself knew it was stupid. You know, he was selling it like it was something he knew shouldn't really happen and it didn't make any sense what happened in the rest of the lesson, but he felt like he had to do it. He felt he had no option. That's a sad place to be. But we have that dominance of assessment frameworks that are absolutely kind of overshadowing much of what goes on. And you have very limited student choice, very limited autonomy, which is something that I'll come back to about the notion of relevance for children and what English is for them if they don't have a real stake in what they're taught and a real choice, a real option and some real sense of ownership of their curriculum. And Beth and I are doing some work with colleagues looking at English teaching in Canada. And the sense Canadian children have in the lessons we've seen of ownership of their curriculum, ownership of what they're reading, of what they're writing, is very, very striking. And Canada is a really interesting example of a state or provincial organisation of curriculum. If you go to Ontario, where we've been, you know, high levels of student engagement and choice, and they're riding very high in PISA. So they're playing the game very differently, but they are meeting the standards reform agenda in that place in Canada. So there are other ways. And when I get to my upbeat, optimistic end to this, I will say that what we must learn from the past and from other countries and from what we already know is that there are other ways to teach English, and they work. You know they work. We've got to convince the whole profession they do, because there are problems with engagement, and there's a massive issue with teacher deprofessionalisation. I was talking to Jeff Barton briefly outside this morning, and he pointed to this himself, that idea of the sense of us, ourselves, as people with some stake in what we're doing and where we're going and some ownership ourselves of what we're doing. Because what I see is not only kids who don't look like they're enjoying teaching, I see plenty of teachers who don't look like they're enjoying English teaching, and that's sad. And I get plenty of emails from people who've been teaching 2 or 3 years who say, I'm either leaving the profession or I'm going to work abroad, and that's sad. It's more than sad, it's a national disgrace, the amount of people leaving the profession. I was talking to a conference where somebody from the DFE was talking about the fact that this is all brought on ourselves, this sense of workload, but there we go. Now, I want to make the point, I'm not blaming English teachers. That 30 years, that standards-based reform, it is unstoppable. It seems to be arguable against. There is no doubt about that, and the pressures of the senior managers that are put on people. So, for people to work differently, it needs a lot of things in place, from senior management support to that kind of sense that you give teachers that they have a stake in what they're doing and they have some power over the direction. So I'm not blaming individual English teachers. I make that very, very clear in the book. But we are where we are, I think, in many, many lessons, and I think we have to be honest about it. And I think we have to be honest, too, that it's not only the standards-based reform agenda that's a threat to English as I would think it should be taught. There are other things. People may, I don't know if people in this room are in schools where they've begun to teach what they're calling a knowledge curriculum or a knowledge-rich curriculum. Now, I want to make very clear before I say this, I'm not against knowledge. Only an idiot would say they're against knowledge, clearly. But if you know about the knowledge curriculum, it's been kind of imported over from the States. It began with work by Hirsch in the States about cultural literacy. It's predicated on this notion that there are certain things that kids need to know at certain ages in order to be able to access the society and culture that we're in. So certain texts that children should have read, certain phrases, certain ways of speaking that they should have learned by certain ages, because that gives them power in the world that they're going to go into, which is a laudable aim. Nobody's going to dispute that as a laudable aim. But there are real issues with the way the knowledge curriculum is being imported into this country and what I'm seeing in schools that have bought into it. And this, I love this next. You can read this next quote yourself, and you can see whether you are as alarmed as I am when you read it. This is from a so-called research note from an organisation called Parents and Teachers for Excellence, as opposed to all the rest of us who clearly aren't for that. And it's from a paper called Why We Need a Knowledge-Based Curriculum. And you can read this, and you can digest it for yourself. And this, to me, sounds all the alarm bells that I get when I go and see lessons that are in schools where they're very powerfully touting, almost in a religious-like way, we are knowledge-rich. Let's have a read of that for a second. Now, if it doesn't send shivers down your spine, that's great. You're a bit mental, but that's great. But if it makes you slightly queasy, there'll be things about it that you may want to question about the ways in which the knowledge curriculum, which is a relatively new phenomenon in this country, it's got a 30-year history in the States, but it's relatively new here. It's touted by many, many of the kind of Twitterati, the blog people who are out there. It's taken hold in quite a lot of free schools and beginning to take hold in some academy chains. There are real issues here, and I don't need me to tell you what they are, but you can see them, that there are questions here. Always, when you have a knowledge curriculum, you've got to say whose knowledge is being privileged and whose is being left out. Now, the notion that you need access to certain knowledge to access the world as it is now, well, that presupposes you're just accepting the world as it is. There are big political questions about whether you think education is to train people to be middle-class citizens, which is essentially what this is doing. So there are political questions about whose knowledge is excluded. And if you go to the States, there's some good research that actually says the very kids that are meant to be benefited by this approach, the working class kids from difficult socio-economic backgrounds, from different ethnic minority cultures, they're the very kids who are actually getting turned off by this curriculum, because what they're feeling is that school is just saying your culture has nothing to do with us. You have to kind of, as Harold Rosen would have said at the time, leave your language at the school gates. And that is a message which is very difficult and can cause kids to say, well, school's not for me. And research is coming out of the States to say, knowledge curriculums are fine, but you have to be very careful with how you frame what you say is valuable knowledge. And you have to think about your conception of learning, this notion that, children learn what they concentrate on. Well, if you read James Britton's introduction in Language Learner in the School, which is probably one of the greatest books written on education, he says, we teach and teach, they learn and learn. If they didn't, we wouldn't. And he goes on to say, but you never know what it is kids are learning from what you're teaching. And that's the joy of teaching, that you don't know. It's not filling an empty bucket, it's not transmission. But the notion that a knowledge-rich curriculum is transferring to kids a whole pile of stuff that they're going to kind of seamlessly and almost kind of by some process of osmosis sink in. This is not the way that kids learn, and you know that. And also the associative pedagogies. If you go and talk to people who are really kind of, as I say, almost cultish about the, I did say cultish, didn't I? Yeah. About the knowledge-rich curriculum, then there are links made to things like, well, okay, so discovery learning is bad, teacher-led stuff is good, group work is bad, talk doesn't help, you've got to be doing it in a certain way. So there's a whole kind of associated pedagogy, which I don't think Hirsch ever actually advocated. That wasn't part of his notion, but it's been kind of bolted on. So you get some curious things happening. And what's the effect? Well, I went to see, here's another anecdote, which is absolutely true. I won't mention the school or the person involved. I went to see a new teacher teach recently at a free school, it was, that's very proud of its knowledge-rich curriculum. So I went to see a Year 7 lesson, and they were teaching Goblin Market, Rossetti's. Now, you might think, oh, that's ambitious, and that's part of this kind of rhetoric, is this is the ambitious thing, is knowledge rich, get them challenged early. So they're doing Goblin Market. But I thought, well, okay, it's Year 7 Goblin Market, what are they going to do? They're going to start drawing pictures of goblins, they're going to get asked to say, what comes into your head when you think about a goblin? No, they were just presented the text, and then they were asked to go through and identify what it was saying about Victorian values about women, or something like that. From the very beginning of the lesson, the first time they'd encountered the poem, didn't read it. Now, this was not a bad teacher. I taught him how to teach, he was brilliant. This was not a bad teacher. He was doing it because that was the approach of the school. They felt this was giving kids challenging material and they were focusing on stuff and knowledge that mattered. But the kids, well, you can imagine, Year 7 kids being asked to do that with Goblin Market, what were they doing? Well, you know, they were looking out the window, they were getting up, they were walking around. They were not engaged with what was going on. But it's a reality. That is the truth of what's going on in some lessons, in some places, with this knowledge-rich curriculum. So it's a problem. And, you know, you are all the good guys. You know that's not a good way or an effective way to teach English. You know group work is good. You know oracy is absolutely at the heart of effective English teaching, so you don't need to be taught any differently. And many, many people know that. But actually, there's also an overarching final worry I'm going to share, which is the kind of the future of teacher education in all of this for English teachers. Because I'm not slagging off school-based initial teacher training. It's very good and it happens very effectively. But if you get school-based initial teacher training in, let's say, an academy chain, and I say this in the book, which is promoting a certain view of English teaching, and the teachers in that then get their CPD only through that academy chain, the worry is, for me, that new entrants to the profession who are trained in certain ways just think this is the way it's done. And again, the arguments and the debates get closed down. And that would be catastrophic for English, because what makes it the subject that it is the fact we have these different views, and we argue and we stay up in the Nate bar late and we talk about what it is we're trying to do. This is worrying, and I was at a conference recently with Sir Andrew Carter, who wrote all the stuff about the ITT report, where I made my mistake of talking about teacher internments rather than internships, which would obviously help retention, but isn't going to do anything else. Now, Andrew Carter is now in charge of leading on apprenticeships, teaching apprenticeships. Now, if you know anything about this, it's quite interesting, but also quite worrying, because he's saying, well, initially there'll be postgraduate apprenticeships, so it'll be people who've done degrees coming back, training to be teachers on the job, effectively replacing probably salaried school direct. Well, fine. But he said, in the future, it's possible, and he says he would like this to happen, essentially is what he was saying, there could be undergraduate apprenticeships. So essentially a school could get its kids through the school, through their sixth form, keep them in school after the sixth form, train them to be teachers in that school. So those kids never see another model of education. They're kind of monsters created in the view of the school. Now, if it's a great school, well, maybe that's great. But even then, I would argue you need to have a bigger view, a broader view. And there is a threat here in the way that we're educating teachers in this country to closing down debates and to making things happen in particular ways. So I'm going to turn to the more optimistic side, because I think in this context the most important thing is that we remember the past, where we've come from, what is rich and what is great about English teaching in the ways that I think it is most effectively done. So there's the two books I've written, which are, you know, they are about the past. I'm not into golden ages. I'm not saying everything was brilliant. I accept the fact that some rubbish teaching went on in the past, as there is now. But in writing a history, what I've tried to do is say, well, these are the things that I think are things about English teaching which are good. And I've tried to say to people through the book that don't just remember them because you know, it was good then before people invented the knowledge curriculum. But actually what happened in the past was approaches to English were developed bottom up from teachers working in classrooms, in collaboration, and researching their own practice. And what came out about key messages about what's good English are not kind of ideologies, and they're not prejudices, they are things that are proved in action, if you like. So this knowledge of history is desperately important. And you can, you check researchers and people like Brian Simon who'll say that, to know about history is to know that things are not always as they have been, and they need not be or may not remain so. Now, the policy wheel will turn, another government will come in, but actually what matters, and I think the lesson from history, is what has really mattered in the development of effective English is what teachers have done from the ground up. Not what people have done from the top down. It's bottom-up stuff that's actually changed English teaching in this country, and that's happened over the course of the 40 or 50 years, I would say, which I've called the Age of Invention, post-Second World War. Now, I've got limited time. I'm looking at the clock up there, so I'm going to have to speed through. But this is critically important. This post-war period, which is covered in my first book and is taken up in my second, is this idea of a new progressive English teaching being developed. Some people call it innate orthodoxy. Now, I'm not going to get into an argument with people about whether it's innate orthodoxy or whether it's an opposition to a Cambridge English or whether it's a London version of English. I don't really care about the definitions. I'm going to try and pick out some of those things which I think are absolutely critical to the way this English teaching developed. And it'll be what is, for many of you, central to your practice. Post-1944, you may not, or may not know, the Butler Act brought in secondary education, compulsory for all. In some places like London, they went for a comprehensive system. It created a huge issue for English teachers, many very quickly trained after the Second World War, to say, OK, we've got a comprehensive intake, kids suddenly in schools at age 14, 15, ultimately 16, who'd never been there before, and a curriculum that wouldn't fit those kids. They had to rethink English from the bottom up and say, what do we do with English to make kids like this, the masses, if you like, engage with our subject? And they did it through professional collaboration, through LATE, through NATE when it was formed in 63, and it was a bottom-up movement. You had the Dartmouth seminar that Bethan referred to, where it kind of crystallised. 40 academics from this country and from the States got together and kind of put into practice a kind of a philosophy, or a manifesto, you could say, in the book Growth Through English, which John Dixon wrote, of what this English looked like. They called it personal growth at the time. Again, I'm not going to get into the definitions. You had a lot of really key projects. Bethan mentioned a couple of them. The Schools Council projects that ran through the 60s and 70s into the 80s. National Literacy Project, Writing Project, the ill-fated Link Project, which some people may remember, that was led by Ron Carter, a great friend of Nate. These were projects that were all based on this notion of English teachers working in their classrooms, researching practice, sharing it, disseminating, developing practice through that action-based research model. You have this English developing. I call it a progressive personal English. It doesn't matter what you define it as. People have different terms for it. But what characterised this period, Tony Burgess from the Institute, now retired, would say what characterised it was English teachers looking for a theory, a unifying theory of English. Now, the reality is nobody ever got there. People went off in different directions. But I would say in this kind of idea of a progressive English that developed, much of which is central still to many, many people's way of teaching, or what they know is good teaching, more kind of unites the different aspects. The names that you see there are critical people in these movements. So you had James Britton, he was much more interested in child development, cognitive development than other aspects. Harold Rosen, we know, was interested in working class kids and language. Nancy Martin, Margaret Meek, particularly interested in reading. Michael Halliday, Peter Doughty, who worked in late in the 60s, before Michael Halliday went over to Australia, of course, they were very interested in functional grammar and developed a whole kind of strand of language in use. And John Dixon was very, very political in his beliefs. They had different ideas about what should be central to English, these people, but what united them, in the phrases people use these days, was greater than what divided them. What held them together was this placing students at the very centre of the curriculum. The language and experience of children at the heart of the subject, and striving for relevance. And not relevance in the sense of let's do comics and magazines, relevance in the sense let's show them why Shakespeare is important to them. Let's make them understand why Dickens is important. So first thing Harold Rosen taught, as you'll know from the book if you read it, to kids in Woolworth was Antony and Cleopatra. That's the first thing he taught to this group of working class kids in Woolworth in South London in 1949. He did that because he wanted them to know why it was important they saw Shakespeare. He was teaching them knowledge, but he was doing it in a way that was entirely different from the way it's phrased now. Important in all these people's practice was oracy, the breadth of reading material, process approaches to writing, as opposed to what we now have is a very genre-based curriculum, coursework assessment, functional grammar, language in use, multiculturalism, interest in gender, student choice and autonomy. These were important to all these people, whether they were interested in language development or literature. The ideas were rooted very much in practice, in teachers concerned. What was not working in your classroom? Well, talk to somebody else about it at a meeting, try a new approach out, bring it back to a meeting. This is how this practice developed. It wasn't kind of ideological, it wasn't prejudicial, it was trying out stuff what worked, frankly, and that's how it developed. And if you see people like Andy Goodwin's work, who's here somewhere, this kind of notion of English in one form or another is still central to many, many people's practice when they're asked. Admittedly, he asks people at things like this, NATE conference, so you might get an answer that you expect, but it is still critical. And when we interview people for English courses, our PGCE course, you still get this notion of what English is coming out. They don't talk about English being about objectives. So, history is very, very important. I'm not into golden ageism, as I say. If you read the book, you'll get my take and my view on what is important about what has happened in the past and what I think could inform the future. I'm going to turn briefly to the future and where we go from here, because I would argue that we need to learn from these other ways of doing things. If we're going to take English forward, if we're going to make English work, we have to exploit the freedoms. They are there. You know, the freedoms are there. I'm not arguing with the government when they say you've got freedom, but we've got to exploit them. We've got to resist this trap. So levels have gone. But you know as well as I do, I go into schools where they've created phenomenally complex assessment systems in Key Stage 3. Flight paths. I still don't get flight paths. I was at a school where the kids come in, they're given a flight path where they're going to end up, and every bit of work is marked either +1, 0, or -1, depending on whether they're above or below their flight path. So if a kid does a bit of work and it's okay, then they get 0, and if it's good, they get 1. And I just think, this is mental, isn't it? This is crazy. But this is replaced levels. That's meant to be, so it's not there. So we need to exploit that freedom because it is there. But we do need to reframe English. We need to make kids engage with it, and we need to show them surely that English is the most important subject in the curriculum, in the world they're living in. This time last year, whenever it was, 24th of June, I woke up and I looked at my 3.5-year-old daughter. Just when the results had come through, I'd woken up and realised that Brexit had happened. I looked at her and I thought, how am I possibly going to explain? Well, I couldn't explain to a 3.5-year-old, clearly. But my point was, when she grows up, how is she going to make sense of this world that we're creating for her? How is she going to make sense of this world? And the only way she's going to do it is through education. And I could educate her myself, but I want the school to do it. I want the system to do it. And that system, English teaching, needs to give kids a sense of how they fit, what's important to them, fits into these things they're told about British values, about where we are in the world, in a post-truth world where there's fake news. And English is screaming out its relevance. English is absolutely screaming out its relevance to kids if we engage them with it. It's about relevance. It's not about politics. It's about putting students at the heart of what we do. And it's about language and literature, and you can see it all over the place. You'll absolutely see that the world is screaming out the relevance of English. You know that Margaret Atwood's book, even before the new adaptation, was climbing up the bestsellers list because of what people were trying to make sense of happening in America. They were seeing the world reflected as it was in Atwood's book. You'll know all the post-truth stuff, Kellyanne Conway's wonderful use of language, that study of language, getting kids to engage in that kind of alternative facts discourse is really important. So Charles Dickens says, Claire Tomlin, more relevant than ever. Ken Stott apparently said Inspector Calls is just as relevant today as it was in 1912. Difficult, given it wasn't written until 1946 or whatever. But actually, that's a sub-editor's glitch. Actually, he says he's very clear that it was written when it was written. And there we have the wonderful Mask of Anarchy in Shelley's own hand. Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, that in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. Jeremy Corbyn's motto that he has lived through an election on that idea of many and few. So, literature and the media are screaming out with reasons English is saying something about the world as it is and can help kids understand where they are, what they do, how they go forward, how they negotiate what it is they are being brought into. Only English can do that. Only English can do that. And only English can do it if it does it and is taught well. So I am cheerful about the future. I've been an English teacher 25 years. I'm going to finish by saying, I get new entrants to the profession every year in my day job. They're full of idealism. They're full of ideas. They point often to post-16 experience. Jeff Barton talked last night, those of you who were here, about his A-level teacher. That's what a lot of the people we interview talk about, their A-level teacher, because their A-level teachers were knowledgeable and they built relationships and they had the passion for their subject. That's what people remember. That's how you breed English teachers, not by having apprenticeships. You breed English teachers by making English speak to kids. And that's what they talk about when they come back and they want to be English teachers. They don't say, I want to have good objectives. They say, I want to make those relationships with children. And there are other types of English teaching. So I mentioned Canada, very different place, but very high performing. And we've just interviewed some people for a research project we're doing comparing English teaching in England, Canada and Scotland. And there was a guy who went to see a comprehensive school just outside North London. They have no schemes of work in Key Stage 4. And this is what he said in an interview about teaching GCSE. We'd rather go in there unarmed with anything other than a book and a pen and sit down and read stories and talk about them together. And he actually lives that in his practice. We went to see a lesson where a bunch of Year 10 kids just talked about Lord of the Flies, and it was a fascinating, brilliant lesson. Not only did we as English teachers think it was brilliant, the maths teachers we shared it with in King's College said, that's incredible, that's a marvellous lesson, because the way that knowledge was built through a dialogue with the kids. Very different model of English, one that made us think we're going back to 1984 or whatever, but it worked, it absolutely worked. And what's important about these ideas is that they do work. And we have the organisations like NATE, like the English and Media Centre, that are promoting these ideas about effective English teaching through their work and research. And we have the nature of English teachers themselves, which, as I say at the very beginning of my book, is, we have a resilience, we have a boundless energy, we have a boundless commitment to making things better for the children that we teach. So finally, We do know things can be different. We have to learn from the past. That's the whole reason I write the books, is to say, what do we learn from the past and from other places? We've got to have that confidence that it works. You know, you've got 5 years with kids from 11 to 16, a very thin national curriculum, all done with terminal exams in 5 years. You've got 5 years to have fun, I would say, to engage kids. They will be able to get through the assessment hurdle if you don't teach them P until the last term of year 11. I guarantee you they will. Because if they've spent 5 years reading different texts, talking about books, thinking about why English is important, engaging in creative, drama, etc., 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 they will have stuff to say about what they've read. And that's what they've got to have, stuff to say, not ways to say it. And too many of them don't have stuff to say. We need to exploit that freedom, as I said. We need to make it relevant. I think, you know, I'm sure English or education can change the world, but if it can, what it needs, two things kids need are English and its teachers. Thank you very much.